Hello everyone. Welcome to the part 4 of the analysis of the budget and economic survey. Last week, in our analysis of budget and economic survey, we had covered the theme of the banking and finance. In this particular week, that is in this particular session, I shall be taking up the theme of the external sector. So before discussing as to what are the themes from the external sector, let me just give you a basic idea of what is the importance of the chapter of external sector from the perspective of your UPSC Prelims examination. That is, how many questions are generally asked, and more importantly, from where are these questions asked. If you see in the previous year prelims from 2011 to 2024, that is almost in last 14 years, we had almost 46 questions from the theme of external sector. It means on an average, you can expect around 2 to 3 questions from the theme of external sector. As you can see, in prelims 2024, there were 2 questions from the external sector. One question was related to the Venezuelan crisis, and another question was with respect to US sovereign debt crisis. Remember, I had shown these 2 questions in my theme of the public finance. Apart from that, as you can see, these questions from the external sector are asked from various topics like BOP, trends, exchange rate, FDI, Forex Reserves, and so on. For example, from the theme of balance of payment, in the previous year prelims, different questions have been asked which tested the students' understanding about what exactly is balance of payment, what are the components of current account, what are the components of capital account. So such kind of questions which test the conceptual understanding of the students. These kind of questions were asked. Secondly, with respect to trends, broadly, 2 types of questions have been asked in the previous year prelims. One is the overall trends in balance of payment. That is, trends in terms of merchandise goods, trends in terms of services, trends in terms of current account deficit, such kind of questions. The other set of questions are related to the trends in terms of export and import of certain specific commodities. In previous year prelims, there was a question related to import of apples into India from US. There was another question with respect to export of gold. So these are the nature of questions where you have to prepare for both broad-based trends in terms of trade as well as trends related to a specific commodity which is in news. Third type of questions are related to exchange rate, where repeatedly questions have been asked with respect to what steps the government or the RBI would take to control the rupee depreciation. Now, FDI, I would say, is one of the most favorite topics of UPSC, because on this topic of FDI, UPSC has asked questions on different dimensions. Questions have been asked with respect to the characteristics of FDI, difference between FDI and FPI, the financial instruments which are eligible to be considered as FDI, what kind of foreign investment can be considered as FDI, and most recently, in the previous year prelims, there was one question related to FDI in the e-commerce sector. So this is how generally questions are asked with respect to different themes under the external sector. So what I have done, I have carefully analyzed the previous year questions from the theme of external sector, and based upon the importance of the different topics, I have picked up these topics which I will be covering in the theme of external sector. So as you can see, I shall be starting with the most basic thing related to balance of payment, important trends for prelims, important budget announcements, rise in non-tariff measures, e-commerce exports, FDI, Forex Reserves, external debt in India, and a current development which is with respect to inclusion of Indian bonds in the global bond indices. So let's start our discussion, wherein first let's have a look at the previous year questions related to basics about balance of payment. Like I said earlier, questions have been asked with respect to meaning of BOP, components of current account and capital account under BOP, as well as this was a very interesting question in Prelims 2011. The question says, in terms of economy, the visit by foreign nationals to witness the Commonwealth Games in India amounted to. Think of it, during Commonwealth Games, a lot of foreign nationals came into India. So in the context of BOP, what would you consider this as? Would you consider this as import or export? Now, some students might confuse this to be a kind of import. Why so? Think of it. If I import a specific commodity into India, the commodity is coming from outside India into India. Same way, some people might think that foreign nationals are coming from outside India into India. So this should be an import of services. This is not import of services. Rather, this is export of services. The reason is very simple. If foreign nationals are coming into India, these foreign nationals are coming with dollars into India, and they are going to exchange their dollar into rupees, and they are going to spend that rupees in India, right? So India is going to get money from the foreign nationals. Because we receive payment from the foreign nationals, this is considered as export of services. Which services, by the way? Here we are exporting tourism. So the right answer, as you can see, was export. So that is how in the previous year prelims questions have been asked with respect to basics about balance of payment. So what I'm going to do in the next 15 to 20 minutes, I'm just going to cover the basics about balance of payment. For those students who already know the basics of balance of payment, I would say this is a kind of revision. And for those students who don't know about what exactly is balance of payment, for them, this discussion will be a completely new discussion. So let's get on with our discussion of what exactly do you mean by BOP, balance of payment. Okay. See, we have certain residents in India and there are certain non-residents. Residents means someone who is staying in India. Non-resident means someone who is staying outside India. Between the residents and non-residents, a number of economic transactions take place. What kind of economic transactions? The transactions may be related to export and import of goods, export and import of services. It could be with respect to inflow and outflow of capital, which is in the form of FDI, FPI, foreign portfolio investment. Similarly, the inflow and outflow could also take place in terms of loans, right? So whenever those economic transactions take place between the residents and non-residents, BOP will keep a record of all those economic transactions. So in simple words, balance of payment is an account. As an account, it will keep a record of all the economic transactions that take place between the residents and non-residents. And if you want to know whether a particular transaction will be part of BOP or not, you must see the two parties involved in the transaction. If both the parties involved in the transactions are residents of India, obviously it will not be accounted in BOP. But if there's a transaction in which one party is a resident and the other party is a non-resident, for sure the transaction should get recorded under the balance of payment. To give you more clarity on this, you can just see BOP is a record of all the economic transactions that take place between residents and non-residents. And these transactions might take place between the governments. It might take place between the companies, or in fact even between the individuals as well. Another important thing that you should know is balance of payment is a flow concept. What do you mean by flow concept? Flow concept means it will keep a record of economic transactions for just one single year. Think of it. The financial year starts on April 1st. At the start of the financial year, the balance of payment would always be equal to 0. Always equal to 0. But later, a lot of transactions will take place between the residents and non-residents. Because of these transactions, it may so happen that there is inflow of money into India. Whenever there's an inflow of money into India, this will be shown as a credit to balance of payment. Credit means it is denoted as positive sign in the BOP. For example, let's say we are exporting goods and services. When we export goods and services, we receive money. No? So when we receive money, it is accounted as inflow. That is, export is accounted as inflow. It is accounted as credit with a positive sign. Same way, there might be certain transactions which might lead to outflow of capital. Think we are importing goods and services for which we need to make payment of money, right? So for imports, which is an outflow, it will be shown as a debit in the balance of payment, and because it's a debit, it will be denoted as negative. So between April 1st to March 31st, that is when the financial year ends, the different transactions are accounted either as credit or as debit, positive value or negative value. It might so happen that by end of March 31st, there could be a possibility number 1 where inflow of money into India is more than the outflow. If inflow is more than the outflow, it means that balance of payment would be obviously positive, right? But this balance of payment which is positive as on March 31st, it will go back to 0 as on April 1st. So what will happen to that surplus money in the balance of payment? You can say that surplus money in the balance of payment will be used to build Forex Reserves. So Forex Reserves of India, in case if balance of payment is positive, the Forex Reserves would increase. Same logic if you apply, if outflow of capital money is more than the inflow of capital, then as on March 31st, BOP would become negative. If BOP becomes negative as on March 31st, what does it mean? It means that for that particular financial year, the outflow of money was more than the inflow. So from where did the excess money go out of India? It means that our Forex reserves for that particular year may have got reduced. So April 1st, we start on a clean slate. April 1st, BOP is always equal to 0. By end of financial year, March 31st, BOP could be positive or negative. And that depends upon what? Inflow and outflow. Some years it could be positive and some years it could be negative, right? So this is what is the concept of the flow concept in BOP. Apart from that, let's understand who do you consider as a Indian resident. This can be a little tricky, so I'm going to discuss this in detail. So in India, what you must understand is the concept of resident is different from the concept of citizenship. Because when you see whether a particular person is a resident or not, we don't see whether that person is a Indian citizen or not. Rather, what we see is that whether the person is in India for more than 182 days in that particular year. So it means that if someone is in India for more than 182 days in a year, and that person could either be a Indian citizen or could be a foreign national, that person will be considered to be a Indian resident for sure. Let me give you some examples. Let's say in the year 2024, I was in India for majority of the year, which is more than 182 days. So in that case, I will be a Indian citizen also, and I will be a Indian resident also. But let's say 2025, for more than 182 days, let's say I was in US working for some US based company. In the year 2025, I'm still a Indian citizen. But will I be considered to be an Indian resident? Obviously not, because for the year 2025, majority of the year I was working in US. This is one example. Another example is, let's say a foreign national comes into India, and in India, if that foreign national is staying for more than 182 days working on some project in India, because he's staying for more than 182 days, that foreign national, even though he's a foreign citizen, we will still consider him to be an Indian resident. That is how you have to understand the concept of resident. But at the same time, there are some exceptions to when you can consider a particular person as a resident. What are these exceptions? Exception number 1. Indian students who go abroad, even for long term, they will always be considered to be Indian residents. Let's say you get a admission in a American university, and you go to American university to pursue your masters, which might be for 2 to 3 years. You are staying in US. So according to this concept of residency, you should not be considered as Indian resident, right? But when we calculate BOP, we have an exception for such kind of people. These students who go abroad even for long term, they will still be considered to be Indian residents. Same logic, if you have Indian patients who go abroad for treatment, those Indian patients will still be considered as Indian residents only. Similarly, if you have Indian diplomats who are working in Indian embassies based in other country, these diplomats may be staying in Indian embassy outside India for more than 1 year or more than 182 days, but still will consider them as Indian resident only. And look at the fourth exception. Tariff of ships and aircrafts that operate outside India's economic territory. For example, people who are working in merchant navy, they spend majority of the year on seas outside India. So even though they are outside India, we'll still consider to be them to be Indian residents. That is the concept of residents from the perspective of individuals. Same logic, as far as companies are concerned, what you must know is both domestic companies and foreign companies can be considered as Indian residents. But for that, these companies should have physical presence in India. Apart from having physical presence, they should have established an office, a branch, or a factory. In that case, we can consider the companies to be resident of India. Take for example, with respect to foreign company, I mentioned if the foreign company has permanent establishment in India. What do you mean by permanent establishment? Permanent establishment means, number 1, it has physical presence in India. Number 2, that physical presence is in the form of office, branch, or factory. So that foreign company will still be considered to be as Indian resident company only. So what is a non-resident then? Non-resident is anything which does not fulfill this criteria. That will be considered as a non-resident. Now, for example, think of it. If you have foreign students, these foreign students are coming to study in India. In India, they might be staying for more than 182 days. Even though they are staying for more than 182 days in a year, we don't consider the foreign students as our residents. They will be considered as the residents of the country from which they have come into India. The reason is very simple. If our students go abroad to pursue education, we will treat our student as our residents. Same way, if students from other countries come to pursue education in India, that country will consider the students as their own residents. That is the same logic. So you can see foreign students in India, the foreign patients who come into India, or foreign diplomats working in India. So they will always be considered as non-residents. So that is the basic idea behind residents and non-residents. So if you get a question as to whether a particular transaction will be covered in BOP or not, like I said earlier, you just need to check who are the parties involved in the transaction. If both the parties are Indian residents, then the transaction will not get recorded under BOP. But if one party is a resident and the other party is a non-resident, for sure, the transaction should get recorded under balance of payment. Now coming to the next part. What kind of transactions are recorded under BOP? One is export and import of goods. Second one, just like export and import of goods, you have export and import of services, which can include travel, transportation, communication, royalties, financial services, and computer services. Let's look at the travel, which includes education, health, and tourism. Okay, let's say this is India. In India, you have non-residents coming into India for the purpose of education, for the purpose of health, for the purpose of tourism. So you must understand, when these people are coming into India, they are getting the foreign currency. That foreign currency they will convert into Indian rupees and they will spend that Indian rupees in India, right? So we are going to receive money. So because we receive money, when someone from abroad comes into India for education, health, or tourism, for India, you must understand it will be considered as export of services. Same way, you have Indian residents who may go abroad for the purpose of education, for health treatment, for tourism. When we go abroad, what we do, at the airport, we will give rupees and get equivalent amount of foreign currency. That foreign currency we are taking out of India. So this is actually outflow. So because it's an outflow, it will be denoted as import of services. One thing which I want to tell you, BOP is always calculated as inflow minus outflow. Money coming in minus money going out. So if I want to look at the net travel, whether India is receiving money or India is taking out money, for that what I have to do, export of services minus import of services, that is inflow minus outflow. Same way, let's look at transportation, that is sea transportation. One example here could be, let's say you have ONGC company and this is a Russian company, Gazprom. ONGC might import crude oil. Though the import of crude oil is actually considered as import of goods. It will be accounted here. But it may so happen that for transportation of the goods, that is crude oil, from Russia to India, ONGC may hire a Singapore based shipping company. So let's say this shipping company, which is involved in transportation of crude oil, is based in Singapore. So ONGC is a Indian resident company. The shipping company based in Singapore is a non-resident company. So obviously, can you see ONGC will make payment? It will make payment to the Singapore based shipping company. For what? For transportation. So what will it be? It will be considered as import. But import of what? Import of transportation services. So what is happening here? Here ONGC is not only importing goods, which is crude oil, ONGC is also importing services, which is transportation services. I could apply the same logic. Let's say a company based in Singapore, it may hire an Indian shipping company to transport goods from Singapore to USA. The company is based in Singapore, which is a non-resident company. It is making payment to Indian shipping company, which is a resident company. So Indian company is getting payment. No? So if we are getting payment for transportation, it is considered as export of transportation services. So with respect to transportation, we could have import also, export also. This is an example of the transportation. Same way, there could be import and export of air transport also. Example being, let's say if I want to take a flight from Delhi to say New York. To take a flight from Delhi to New York, I may book a flight on, let's say, Emirates Airlines. I'm an Indian resident. Emirates Airlines is a non-resident company. So when I make payment, it will be considered as import of air transportation. Another example, let's say you have Air India. Air India is operating a flight between Paris and New York. Now all the people who are traveling on that flight may be non-residents. So non-residents are making payment to Air India. So Air India is receiving payment. So it is export of air transportation services. That is how you should know what is an import or export. You could apply the same logic to postal services, financial services, and computer services. And like I said, it is always denoted as inflow minus outflow. Now this is something which is interesting. Royalties and license fee. Let's say there's an Indian company. This Indian company is using a patent of a foreign company. Because it is using a patent of foreign company, the Indian company is required to pay some royalty to the foreign company. It is an outflow. Same way, if there is a foreign company, this foreign company may be using a patent which is held by Indian company. So the foreign company will be required to pay a royalty to the Indian company. So this will be a inflow. So it is inflow minus outflow. That is how things are calculated. The next one is quite interesting. It is primary income and secondary income. So what is this primary and secondary income? Let's understand this through an example. Let's say you have residents in India and these are non-residents. The residents based in India, they may provide for factors of production to the non-residents. What are the factors of production? You could say land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. In return for factors of production, the residents will receive what is called as factor income. They will get factor income from non-residents. For example, for the labor that residents may provide for non-residents, they get wages, right? For capital, which they provide for capital, they may get interest. For providing entrepreneurship, they may get profits. And for providing land, they may earn rent. So these are the factors of production. Let me just give an example. Let's say I am a Indian resident and I go and work in a US based company for a short term, let's say less than 182 days, which means I'm a resident and the US company is a non-resident. US companies pay me wages, right? So that is this. Second, I may invest in US bonds, like US treasury bonds. When I invest in US treasury bonds, on such investment I will get interest. Same way, I may start a company in US, like you have companies such as Infosys, right? They have established their branches. On that branches, they are earning profit. Some of that profit, they may send it back into India. So that is a kind of factor income. Similarly, let's say I own a commercial property in US. On that commercial property in US, I may earn rent. So that's a factor income for me. These are the different examples where, residents might earn income from non-residents. Same logic, non-residents may provide for factors of production to the residents, and in return, the non-residents as such will earn factor income. So the factor income for them would be once again in the form of wages, interest, profit, and rent. So if we want to calculate net primary income, remember I told you in BOP, whenever you want to calculate any component of BOP, it is always inflow minus outflow, right? So how do you calculate net primary income? Inflow minus outflow, which means the factor income earned by residents from non-residents minus factor income earned by non-residents from residents. That is how you'll calculate the net primary income. Clear? So this is how primary income is calculated. Similar to that, we have another concept of secondary income. What is this secondary income? Now let's say you have residents and you have non-residents. Here, in case of factor income, what is happening here is residents are providing for some factors of production. On providing for factors of production, they are getting payment. But in case of secondary income, what happens is residents get some payment. And these payments, they are getting without providing for anything, without providing for factors of production. So you can consider this as a kind of unilateral transfer. Why is it unilateral? Because in this case, you provide something, in return for providing the factors of production, you get the payment. In this case, you don't provide anything. Without providing anything, you get the payment. And such payments that we get without providing for factors of production, we call this as transfer payment. What can be the transfer payment? The transfer payment here could be gift, donation, grants, and more importantly, it is the remittances. I'm based in India. One of my family member is non-resident. That non-resident family member may give me some gift. It is transfer payment. Similarly, there's an NGO based in India. This NGO based in India may get a donation from a non-resident. Or the Indian government may get a grant from World Bank. And we may get remittances from outside India, right? Same way, even the non-residents can get transfer payments from residents in the form of gift, donation, grants, and remittances. For example, let's say Indian government gives a grant to a African country. It will be a kind of transfer payment, right? So, how is net primary income calculated? Inflow minus outflow. Same way, the net secondary income in this particular case will also be calculated as inflow minus outflow, which is transfer payments received by residents minus transfer payments received by non-residents. That is what is net secondary income. So this is what is part of balance of payment. We covered goods are included, services are included, factor income is included, transfer payment is also included. Factor income, the net factor income, we call it as primary income, and the net transfer payment, we call it as secondary income. So this is what I have highlighted here as well. And lastly, we have capital transfers, which might be in the form of FDI, FPI, external commercial borrowings, and so on. All of this constitutes the capital transfers, right? So this is what you should know with respect to balance of payment. Let's look at different scenarios and identify whether a scenario will be part of BOP or not. And within BOP, what will it be considered as? For example, let's say money is spent by Indian tourist in Singapore. Indian tourist is a Indian resident. This Indian resident goes to Singapore. In Singapore, he spends money. So he is giving money to a non-resident. So it should be accounted under BOP. But what will it be? It will be considered as import of tourism. It will be accounted. Money spent by foreign patient to get treatment in AIMS hospital. Remember I told you, if a foreign patient comes into India and if he is trying to get treatment, and that treatment might be even for long term also, that foreign patient will always be considered as non-resident. So this non-resident is making payment to an hospital, AIMS hospital in Delhi. So because we are receiving payment, it will be considered as export. Export of what? Export of medical services. Bill paid by foreign student in a restaurant in Delhi. Foreign student, even if he is in India for long term, will still consider the foreign student to be an Indian resident. And if he is paying bill to a restaurant in Delhi, that restaurant is a Indian resident company. So it should be accounted under BOP. Mobile exported by Foxconn company based in Bangalore. I told you, if a foreign company has physical presence in the form of a office, branch or factory, we consider that foreign company to be Indian resident company. So Foxconn company, which is based in Bangalore, is an Indian resident company. It is exporting. So obviously, it will be accounted under BOP. Money paid by ONGC to Indian shipping company for transportation of crude oil. So this is little interesting. ONGC is a resident company to whom it is paying money for transportation of crude oil. It is paying money to Indian shipping company, and this is also a resident company. Remember the example which I gave you? In that example, I said ONGC is paying money to a shipping company based in Singapore. But here, ONGC is paying money to a shipping company based in India. Both are resident companies. If transaction is taking place between two resident companies, it will not be accounted under balance of payment. Profits earned by US resident on the shares in India. Obviously, it will be accounted as what? Factor income earned by non-residents from residents. Interest earned by Indian residents on government security. Indian resident is a resident of India, and interest on government securities is paid by Indian government. Both are residents of India, right? So it will not be accounted. Money earned by Air India on flights operated between France and New York. it should be included. Some of you might think, what if one of that passenger who is traveling on this flight is a Indian resident? Here I am assuming that all the passengers on this flight are non-resident, and these non-residents are paying for airfare to Air India, which is a resident company. So that is why it will be accounted. Money donated by Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation based in US to an Indian NGO, yes. Salary earned by Indian diplomat working in Indian embassy in US. Remember I told you, if you have Indian diplomats working in Indian embassy outside India, even though they are based outside India, we'll still consider them to be Indian resident. So Indian diplomat is a Indian resident. Now who is paying salary to that Indian diplomat? Indian government is paying salary, no? So both are residents. So obviously it will not be accounted under balance of payment. So these are some basic things that you need to know with respect to balance of payment. So let's go into the next part now. So having covered the basics about BOP, now we are going to look into the trends in BOP. But before looking into trends in BOP, let's have a look at the previous year questions, so that you get a basic idea as to what kind of questions have been asked in the previous year prelims. Based upon that, how should you prepare for the upcoming prelims examination? You can see here a broad-based question on status of imports and exports of India. Prelims 2023, a factual question wherein you are required to identify what is India's share in the global merchandise exports. Here, Prelims 2020, a question on India's bilateral trade with countries such as Sri Lanka, Nepal, and Bangladesh. Export of gold, about which I have already mentioned. Import of apples from US. So, questions are either broad-based trends in terms of trade or questions related to specific commodity which is in news, like gold, apple, and so on. Apart from that, questions have also been asked on variants of crude oil, like West Texas Intermediate and Brent crude oil. So, having understood what kind of questions are asked in the previous year prelims, now let's get into the trends in BOP. Okay, we have discussed the basics about BOP, that BOP is nothing but an account. As an account, it will keep a record of all the economic transactions between residents and non-residents. Now, if you see BOP is in turn calculated as current account plus capital account. Current plus capital. Further, current account is in turn calculated as balance of trade, BOT, plus balance of invisibles. These two together make up the current account. Balance of trade is export minus import of only goods. It does not take into account export and import of services. The reason being, export and import of services is accounted in balance of invisibles. So it is balance of trade plus balance of invisibles. We'll come to invisibles later. Let's concentrate here. That is balance of trade. So I told you that BOP is always calculated as inflow minus outflow. So please understand, it is export minus import, not import minus export. So if exports from India is more than the imports, then the balance of trade would be positive. Positive means surplus. On the contrary, if import of goods is more than the export of goods, balance of trade would be negative, that is trade deficit. What you must know, that in India, the balance of trade is always negative. When I say always negative means India is a net importer of goods. Import of goods is always more than the export of goods. Apart from that, if you look at the trends in balance of trade, it is being said that since 1991, balance of trade has always been negative for India. It is always negative. In fact, if you see since 1947, that is since the time India has gained independence, except for 2 years, that is 1972 and 1976, except for these 2 years, balance of trade has always been negative. So that's a trend that you have to remember. So BOT for sure is always negative because India is a net importer of goods. What about balance of invisibles? Let's see here one by one. India is a net importer of goods, but good thing is India is a net exporter of services. Net exporter of services means export of services from India is more than the import of services. So this value for India is always positive, this value. If you see net primary income, which are discussed, factor income earned by residents from non-residents minus factor income earned by non-residents from residents. That is net primary income, right? That net primary income for India is usually negative, which means the factor income earned by non-residents from residents is actually more. But the net secondary income for India is actually positive thanks to remittances. So some of you must be knowing that India receives the world's highest remittances. According to World Bank, last year, the total remittances coming into India was somewhere around $129 billion. So India receives the world's highest remittances. You can see India's is followed by Mexico and China. So look at this. Balance of invisible services is positive. Net primary income is negative. Net secondary income is positive. Overall, if you see balance of invisibles is positive. Trade is negative, balance of invisibles is positive. What will be the current account? Think of it. If this is minus $100 and this is plus $100, what will be the current account? Minus 100 plus 100, current account will become equal to 0. On the contrary, if this is minus $100 and if this is plus $200, minus 100 plus 200 means current account will be in surplus, right? Third scenario, what if this is minus 100 and this is plus 50? Minus 100 plus 50, current account will be in deficit, minus 50. So I give you 3 scenarios. Out of these 3 scenarios, what is the actual scenario in India? As far as India is concerned, please understand that the negative value on balance of trade is generally higher than positive value on balance of invisibles. You can see here, usually negative value on balance of trade is higher than positive value on balance of invisibles. So general scenario could be the balance of trade could be minus 100 and balance of invisibles could be plus 50. So current account is usually in deficit. Usually it is in deficit. But let's look at the trends in current account in the last few years. You can see here, India's current account was in surplus for the first time in the last 17 years in the year 2020-21. It was in surplus. But otherwise, it is generally in deficit. It is generally negative. And for the current year also, it isn't going to be negative only. Apart from that, there are 2 concepts that I would want to tell you. We know India is a net importer of goods. and India is a net exporter of services. But if you combine both goods and services, what is India's status? Whether India is a net importer of goods and services or India is a net exporter of goods and services. For that, let's look at the concept of net exports. Net exports is calculated as total export of goods and services minus total imports of goods and services. Total export of goods and services is somewhere around 22%. Total import of goods and services is around 24%. So 22 minus 24, net exports for India is minus 2, which means India is a net importer of goods, India is a net exporter of services, and India is a net importer of goods and services. This is what is important. Similar to net exports, you have another concept, trade to GDP ratio. Please look at the differences. Net export is export minus import, whereas trade to GDP ratio is total value of exports plus total value of imports. 22 plus 24, which is 46%. So this is what is trade to GDP ratio. Apart from that, let's see here. Coming to capital account. Capital account will include capital transfers like FDI, FPI, external commercial borrowings, loans, and so on. In India, like I said, current account is usually negative, but fortunately, capital account is usually positive. So think of BOP. BOP is current account, which is negative, plus capital account, which is positive. So what will be BOP? Will it be negative or positive? Can I say it all depends upon the negative value of current account and the positive value on the capital account, right? So same logic, what I applied here, you could apply the same logic there also. If negative value on current account is more than the positive value on capital account, then BOP would be negative. On the other hand, if positive value on capital account is more than the negative value on current account, then BOP would be positive. What you must know, in India, generally, the capital account surplus, that is positive value on capital account, is generally higher than negative value on current account, which means BOP generally in India is positive. That is what you must know. But is it always positive? Can you see in the last 5 years, BOP generally has been positive except for 1 year, that is 22-23. As far as the current financial year is concerned, it is expected to be positive. So that is why, because generally BOP in India has been positive. And I told you, if at the end of the financial year, if BOP is positive, there's surplus money in BOP, the surplus money will be transferred to Forex Reserves and our Forex Reserves will increase. So one of the reasons as to why our Forex Reserves have been increasing is because balance of payment generally has been positive in India. Why is it positive? Not because of import and export of goods. It is because of the fact that we receive highest amount of FDI, FPI, and so on. That's the reason why the BOP is generally positive for India. Now let's take up. You can just look at the prelims pointers, right? You can go through this. Now let's look at the trends in merchandise goods through charts. Like I said, with respect to goods, merchandise goods, India generally faces a trade deficit. Trade deficit means India's import of goods is more than the export of goods, right? With respect to export of goods, which is highlighted in blue line, you can see that our export of goods crossed $400 billion for the first time in the year 21-22. And since then, they have increased. Apart from that, if you see overall export of goods in the last 1 decade, it is said that overall export of goods has increased by almost 40% in the last 1 decade, which is, I would say, a positive development. And under the foreign trade policy 2023, our target is to have merchandise exports of at least $1 trillion by 2030. That is our target under foreign trade policy. And can you see now our exports is somewhere like $440 billion. So it is quite a challenging task before India to meet the target of 1 trillion merchandise exports by 2030. The second thing which I want to tell you is actually a point of concern. The concern here is, can you see the trade deficit? The trade deficit means the gap between import and export was actually lower. But the recent years, the trade deficit, the gap between imports and exports has widened. The trade deficit has widened. That is one point of concern. So we have to focus on reducing our imports and focus on increasing our exports. Only then the trade deficit gap will get narrowed down. All these things I've highlighted here. You can just go through that. In fact, like I said, India faces merchandise trade deficit. This was a question asked in Prelims 2020. Apart from that, if you see India's share and rank in the world merchandise exports, in the year 2014, India's share in the world merchandise exports was just 1.70%. From 1.70%, it has increased to 1.82%. In fact, this was a question which was asked in Prelims 2023. As far as India's rank in the global merchandise export is concerned, it was ranked at 19th place. From 19th place, now it has jumped to 17th place. These are some facts which you have to remember from the perspective of the prelims examination. Now let's look at the top export and import commodity. Top export commodities is number 1, engineering goods. What are engineering goods? Engineering goods include different products such as iron and steel, industrial machinery, automobiles, auto components, etc. And what is interesting is the share of engineering goods in our total export basket has increased to almost 25%. The second major export commodity is petroleum products. We know that India is an importer of crude oil. Almost 85% of our crude oil requirements, we are importing it from countries such as Russia and Iraq. After importing crude oil, we process the crude oil into petroleum products like petrol, diesel, aviation turbine fuel, and so on. And some of these petroleum products, we are in turn exporting them to other countries. What is interesting here is India is considered to be among the top 5 exporters of petroleum products. And the country to which we export the petroleum products the most is actually Netherlands. Interestingly, until last year, the third largest export commodity for India was gems and jewelry. But for the current year, gems and jewelry has been overtaken by telecom equipment. What is telecom equipment? You could say telecom equipment like a hardware which is used in telecommunication industry. The hardware could be like antenna, or you could be optical fibers, routers, modems, telephones. All of this include the telecom equipment. And as you can see, now the third largest export commodity for India is telecommunication instruments. And top export destination for India include US, UAE, and Netherlands. As far as import of commodities is concerned, the top most import of commodity is petroleum crude. You must be knowing that because of Russia-Ukraine war, because US has put economic sanctions on Russia, India has been able to get crude oil from Russia at a discounted price. So over a period of time, the share of Russia in the import of crude oil into India has increased. In fact, it has increased to almost 33%. So right now, Russia is the topmost supplier of crude oil, followed by Iraq. Second major item of import for India is gold. In fact, India is the second largest consumer of gold. Third is petroleum products. Some of you might get confused. So how come petroleum products could be a major item of export also and a major item of import also? What you must understand is, when I say export of petroleum products, I am specifically referring to petroleum products such as petrol, diesel, and naphtha, aviation turbine fuel, and so on. These are the petroleum products which we are exporting. But there are some petroleum products for which there is huge demand in the Indian economy, and we are not being able to meet this demand on our own. So these are the petroleum products which we are importing from other countries. And which are these petroleum products? These petroleum products, as you can see, they include LPG, pet coke, which is basically used in iron and steel industry, and bitumen. So these are the petroleum products which we are actually importing, and they constitute the third largest share of imports. And the country from which we are importing most is China, followed by Russia and UAE. Let's move to the next part, that is trends in terms of services. Like I said, India generally enjoys a trade surplus in services, which is export of services is more than the import of services. But presently, one important trend that you should know is, when you see export of services with export of goods, in terms of absolute value, export of goods is more than the export of services in terms of absolute value. But if you see the average growth rate in export of services, let's say in the last 5 years, the growth rate of services is around 10%, and the growth rate in export of goods is around 5%. So can you see the rate at which export of services is increasing is almost double the growth rate in the export of goods. That is why it is expected by 2030, let's say in another 5 years down the lane, this is going to reverse, wherein export of services is going to overtake the export of goods. Now, this is a very interesting development which is going to take place in next 5 years. So you have to remember this thing. So that's what I have mentioned here. You can go through these things. Apart from that, I've also highlighted India's share in the world services exports has increased from 3.202% to 4.39%, and India presently plays at 7th place. What are the top items of export of services from India? Interestingly, there are just two services which account for almost 89% of export of services from India. Just two services. Which are these two services? Let's see this. The first one is software and IT services. Software and IT services account for more than 50% of total export of services. In fact, it is 56%. After IT and software services, it is followed by other business services. Other business services include accounting and auditing, consultancy, legal services, architectural services, and so on. So when Indian companies provide for these services to foreign companies, what kind of services we are providing? Accounting service, consultancy service, legal service, architectural service, we are getting paid for that, right? So that is the second largest share in terms of our export. And in terms of import of services, The top import is charges for the use of intellectual property. Remember, I discussed this thing in the topic of BOP. Let's say you have a Indian company. This Indian company is using a patent which is owned by a foreign company. For use of patent owned by a foreign company, the Indian company is required to pay a royalty to the foreign company, right? So this is the major item of payment in our services, and that is followed by travel and transportation. What is included in travel and transportation? I showed you that in travel we include education, health, tourism, and in transportation we include sea transportation as well as air transportation. So that is the general trend in terms of services. Now let's look at the trends in goods and services combined. We saw trends in goods, we saw trends in services. Now we are looking at trends in both goods and services combined. Now here, let's say this is India and this is another country X. From another country X, we might be importing goods and services, and to other country X we might be exporting goods and services. So let's say if export of goods and services from India is more than the import of goods and services, then we could say that India enjoys trade surplus with the country X, trade surplus. Same way, if India's import of goods and services is more than the export of goods and services, then we can say that India has a trade deficit with country X. So that way in UPSC prelims, you could get a question as to which is India's largest trading partner. That is both in terms of import and export. Now, recently it was reported in media that China has overtaken US to become India's largest trading partner. That is, if you combine both imports and exports. That's the first thing. Apart from that, in UPSC prelims, you could get a question as to with which countries has India got trade surplus and with which country India has trade deficit. These are the two types of questions that you can get. So you can see here I have highlighted the list of countries with which India has trade surplus. And the countries here include US, Netherlands, Bangladesh, Nepal, UK and Sri Lanka. You must understand that being a developing country, India will generally enjoy a trade surplus with poor countries. That is quite understandable. But what is interesting is India enjoying trade surplus with a developed country, and this can be a little tricky. So just focus on the developed countries with which India has a trade surplus. Which are these countries? These include USA, UK, Belgium, France and Italy. And the countries with which India has trade deficit, the highest trade deficit which India has is with China, almost $75 billion. It is followed by Russia, Iraq, Switzerland, UAE. I think if you look at West Asian countries, with those West Asian countries, it is quite natural for India to have a trade deficit because we are importing crude oil, right? So just try to remember the list of countries with which India has a trade surplus. This can be a little tricky as far as your prelims examination is concerned. Now let's take up some important questions related to trends. Consider the following items of exports from India. Which of the following correctly describes the descending order of products in terms of export value in India? Descending order. Descending order, first is engineering goods, followed by petroleum products, followed by telecom instruments. So it should be 1, 2, 4 and 3. Answer is B. Consider the following statements related to export of services from India. Please try to attempt this particular question on your own. And let me know the answer in the chat box below. Practice MCQ number 3. Let's see this question. Increase in foreign remittances into India lead to rupee appreciation. If you receive more foreign remittances into India, we receive foreign remittances in terms of dollar. So there will be more dollar inflow. If dollar supply increases, then the dollar value will reduce. And if the dollar value reduces, rupee value will increase. So increase in foreign remittances into India will obviously lead to rupee appreciation. But let's look at the second one. Rupee depreciation benefits the people receiving foreign remittances from other countries. So let's say this is me, and I have a family friend based in US. This family friend based in US sends me $1 in the year 2024, where $1 is equal to 80. So when I receive $1, I'll convert $1 into rupees and I will get rupees 80 in 2024. In 2025, my relative still sends me $1 only. Let's say in the first situation, $1 is now equal to 70. $1 equal to 70 means rupee value has appreciated as compared to previous year. When I convert dollar into rupees, I am going to get only 70 rupees, right? So if I get 70 rupees as compared to previous year when I was getting 80, I'm losing out. On the contrary, if $1 becomes equal to 90 as compared to this is an example of depreciation. So when I convert dollar into rupees, I am going to get 90 rupees as compared to 80 rupees which I used to get before. So I'm going to get benefited. So rupee depreciation will obviously benefit the people receiving foreign remittances from other countries. Are both the statements correct? Yes, both the statements are correct. But does the second statement explain the first statement? Obviously not, right? So the right answer in this case is B. Similarly, I hope you should be able to go through this practice question, and please let me know the answer in the chat box, right? Let's look at some important news related to India's trade, starting with defense imports into India. There is one international organization called as Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. This particular international organization publishes the trends in terms of import and export of defense goods at a global level. Recently, in March 2025, this particular organization has published a report wherein it has tracked the import and export of defense goods for the period 2019 to 2024. That is for a period of 5 years. According to this particular international organization, it is highlighted that Ukraine has overtaken India to become the largest importer of defense goods. So India until 2019 was the largest importer of defense goods, but now India has become the second largest importer. The top exporter of defense goods include USA, France, and Russia. And which are the countries which are the top supplier of defense goods to India? It is actually Russia, France, and Israel. But one interesting thing which the report has highlighted is until 2019, share of Russia in the total import of defense goods into India was around 55%, which means more than half of our defense imports used to come from Russia. But now, share of Russia in our defense imports has got reduced to 35%. And this is quite understandable because India is trying to diversify its defense suppliers. India does not want to be overly dependent upon one single country for import of defense goods. The second important development is with respect to telecommunication equipment, telecom instruments. Like I said, telecommunication equipment or instruments include antenna, optical fibers, modem, routers, telephones, etc. Until few years back, India was one of the largest importer of telecommunication equipment. And most of this telecommunication equipment we used to import from China. This caused two problems before India. Problem number one, huge trade deficit with China. Problem number two, according to some security experts, it also posed security risk. So, in order to become Atmanirbhar Bharat with respect to telecommunication equipment, the Indian government launched PLI scheme for telecommunication equipment. And thanks to PLI scheme, the overall trade deficit in telecommunication equipment has reduced from 68,000 crores to just 4,000 crores in the last 5 years. So you can see the overall trade deficit has got reduced to just 4,000 crores. And now almost 60% of telecommunication equipment we are able to manufacture in our own country. So India has become self-sufficient in antenna, GPON, optical fiber, consumer premises equipment, that is routers, modems and telephones. What is important here is, even now India is not a net exporter, understand. India is still a net importer only, but the imports of telecommunication equipment has reduced. That is why our trade deficit has narrowed down. Next one is with respect to export of solar photovoltaic cells. I would say this is a phenomenal turnaround which India has had. China is a global leader in the manufacturing of solar PV cells, accounting for 60% of the manufacturing of solar photovoltaic cells. So India used to import huge amount of solar panel cells from China, which obviously led to the huge trade deficit and import dependence on China. So in order to become self-sufficient with respect to solar panel cells, we launched PLI scheme. So that is why the production of solar panel cells in India has increased. This is one development. Second development, remember in my first discussion, we discussed the topic of geo-economic fragmentation as well as China plus one strategy. So countries are trying to diversify away from China so as to reduce the dependence on China. One such country is US. So US has increased the customs duty on import of Chinese solar panel cells. So India is seeing this as an opportunity now. So the production of solar panel cells in India has increased. So now India has capitalized on China plus one strategy and has started exporting more solar panel cells to US. In fact, you can see the numbers. Numbers speaks a lot. Export of PV modules has risen exponentially by more than 23 times in just last 2 years alone. And 97% of India's exports are going to just one country. So this is quite important. So you should know this. Next one is with respect to smartphones. India has had a phenomenal turnaround with respect to manufacturing of smartphones. Until 2014, almost a decade back, India was a net importer of smartphones. From a net importer, now India has become a net exporter of smartphones. Apart from that, India has now become the second largest producer of smartphones at the global level. One achievement that we had with respect to export of smartphones is last year, the total export of smartphones increased to whopping $20 billion. And most of the smartphones that we exported to other countries actually was Apple iPhone. So this is another turnaround that we had with respect to smartphones. The next one is with respect to LNG, liquefied natural gas. India imports almost 85% of its crude oil requirement. Same way, India also imports liquefied natural gas. But what has happened in the past few years is the production of liquefied natural gas has stagnated, but the demand for LNG has increased. So there's a demand supply mismatch. So what India has been doing is it has been importing more liquefied natural gas. As far as last year is concerned, the import of liquefied natural gas has increased to 51% of our domestic natural gas requirement. So more than half of our natural gas requirement we are importing. That's a current development. And most of the natural gas we are importing it from Qatar. That's a development. Lastly is with respect to steel. India was a net exporter of steel until 2023. In 2023, India became a net importer of steel. Why did India start importing steel? It is because of dumping of steel by Chinese steel makers in the Indian domestic market. Remember, we discussed about the real estate crisis in China, right? So the real estate in China is not booming. It has got stagnated. But steel makers in China have increased the steel production. But there's no demand for steel in China. So these steel makers of China, they are dumping their steel in other countries, including India. So most of the steel that we're importing is actually cheaper steel from China. This has adversely affected the steel manufacturers in India. So that is what you have to know here with respect to development of steel industry. Apart from that, let's have a look at important trends here. Look at this question, practice MCQ number 5. Export of solar PV modules has risen exponentially in last 2 to 3 years. If you look at the word exponentially, usually the tendency of the students is to mark the statement as incorrect. But in this case, like I said, it is actually correct because it has increased by almost 23 times. So this is correct. India has benefited from China plus one strategy adopted by other countries. Yes. So both the statements are correct. And in fact, the second statement is explaining the first statement. The right answer is A. Next here, if you see in prelims 2020 and in prelims 2011, questions have been asked with respect to different variants of crude oil. In different parts of the world, crude oil is mined, but there is a small difference between the crude oil in terms of their sulfur content, in terms of their fuel efficiency. So what we do for the crude oil mined in different parts of the world, we have different names, different grades for them. For example, the crude oil which is mined in US, we call it as West Texas Intermediate, and the crude oil which is mined from North Sea, we call it as Brent crude oil. In fact, one of the famous characteristic of Brent crude oil is that it contains less amount of sulfur. So the statement says it does not contain any sulfur. It does contain, but it has less sulfur content. So based upon the kind of questions, what you should know is you should know different variants of crude oil mined across the world. So what I've done, I've prepared this table highlighting the different variants of crude oil from different countries like Saudi Arabia, Arab Light, Nigeria, Bonny Light, Algeria, Saharan Blend, Russia, Urals and Sakol. And I would say this is important because India has, because Russia has become one of the top supplier of crude oil to India. And the crude oil is Ural and Sakol. That is what you must know. Now let's coming to the next set of trends, which is with respect to agriculture. If you see the previous year questions related to trends in agricultural trade, you can very well see that questions are asked with respect to trends in agricultural export, trends in agricultural imports, and trends in terms of agricultural import of certain specified commodity which is in news. So keeping this in mind, let's look at some recent developments which have taken place with respect to agricultural trade. Now, this was an Indian Express explained article which had appeared in March 2025, which says that India's agricultural trade surplus is shrinking. What is this shrinking of agricultural trade surplus? Let's understand this. You must understand that India is a net exporter of agricultural commodities. Net exporter means export of agricultural commodities is more than the import of agricultural commodities, and that has been the situation since 1991. So India generally enjoys trade surplus in terms of agricultural commodities. So export is more than the import. If you see India's share in the global export of agricultural commodities, it is around 2.5%. And India is the world's 8th largest exporter of agricultural commodities. The top agricultural commodities that we export to other countries include rice, which include both basmati rice and non-basmati rice, followed by marine products and then spices. Now, coming back here as to why is the trade surplus shrinking? Trade surplus is shrinking because if you see exports is more than the imports, so generally it is positive value for India. But this exports is reducing and imports is increasing. The trade surplus is still positive only. But what has happened to this positive value? This positive value has got reduced because our exports have declined and our imports have increased. Export of which commodity has got reduced? Number one, there has been decrease in export of sugar, followed by decrease in export of wheat, and third is decrease in export of non-basmati rice. The question is, why have the export of three commodities reduced? See, basically India, as you know, has put a ban on export of agricultural commodities. Some of these commodities on which India has put a ban include non-basmati rice, wheat, as well as sugar. The reason is very simple. We had a shortfall of these commodities in our domestic market. Because of the shortfall, the Indian government decided to put a ban to control the rising inflation. So that has led to fall in our exports. Top 3 agricultural commodities that we import include vegetable oils, pulses, and fresh fruits. And why have our imports increased? Number one, our import of edible oil have increased because of Russia-Ukraine war. Because of Russia-Ukraine war, as you know, there was a shortage of sunflower oil, and the shortage of sunflower oil led to increase in their prices. So the import of edible oil prices increased. Second is, in India we had a shortage of pulses. So shortage of pulses led to increase in our imports as well. So what is important here is about the trends in import of pulses. So let's have a look at the next one. As you can see, according to this particular chart, the dal imports, that is import of pulses, have hit a 7-year high. You can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, highest in the last 7 years. Our import of pulses have increased. Why? Because of shortage of pulses in India. There are some prelims pointers which I have highlighted about pulses. You can just go through that. But I would want you to focus on the last part, import of pulses. There are different pulses that we grow in India. Among the different pulses that we grow, as you can see, gram or chickpea, which is basically chana dal, it accounts for the highest share of production in India. So in terms of production, it is gram or chickpea which account for 33% of the total production. In fact, this was a question asked in Prelims 2020. But with respect to import of pulses, which pulse are we importing the most? That is what is important. And as you can see, the pulse that we are importing the most is lentil, that is masoor dal, followed by matar, peas. So you can see here that generally one would think that because we are facing a shortage of pulses in India, we should not be imposing customs duty on import of pulses. But you can very well read the heading here. India imposes 10% duty on lentils, which is masoor dal. Even though we are importing masoor dal the most, actually we are imposing custom duty. On the other hand, when it comes to import of yellow peas is matar, there is no customs duty. Why it is important? Let me show you a previous year question. You'll get to know about it. Can you see here the second statement? The government does not impose any custom duty on all the imported edible oils as a special case, which was incorrect, right? So that is how you should keep an eye for the previous year questions. So accordingly, let's look at practice MCQ number 6. India's export of agricultural commodities has consistently increased in last 5 years. Is there a consistent increase? No. In fact, it has been fluctuating. Marine products account for the largest share of exports, followed by basmati rice. This might be confusing for some students. If you say rice, rice includes both basmati rice and non-basmati rice. Rice as one commodity, its share of exports is more than marine products. But if you compare marine products with just basmati rice, by excluding non-basmati rice, the share of marine products is higher. So that is why the statement is correct. Pulses account for largest share of imports? No. In fact, it is edible oils. Answer is 2 only. Practice MCQ number 7. Indian government does not impose any customs duty on import of pulses as a special case, which is incorrect. India is one of the largest importer of pulses. It is correct. So the right answer in this case is D. Now coming to the next topic of important budget announcements with respect to the international trade or the external sector. Now to discuss the important budget announcements made by the finance minister, what I have done, as you can see here, I have differentiated the announcements under 4 different topics. So while discussing the announcements, what I will be doing here is I shall also be discussing the reason for the announcement, so that you are able to get a more clarity with respect to why a particular measure was undertaken or why a particular announcement was made in this year's budget. So let's start with the exports. So what are the problems or challenges faced by India in terms of exports? Like I said, India is a net importer of goods and services, where we discussed that the net exports for India is -2. Now, this is a constraint for India in order to become Viksit Bharat by 2047. So we need to pursue a export-led model similar to one which is pursued by China. So obviously we have to increase our exports and reduce our imports. That is the first thing. Apart from that, as you can see, there is a regional disparity in terms of exports from India. 2 states alone, that is Gujarat and Maharashtra, these 2 states alone account for almost 50% of our merchandise exports. So we need to ensure that even the underdeveloped states are able to export their goods to other countries. Similarly, our export basket is not diversified in terms of the destination. As you can see, almost 50% of India's exports, they go to just 10 destinations. It means our exports are concentrated in just 10 countries. Now, this is problematic because in future, if these countries like US, if they impose additional barriers on India's imports, that is the goods which are importing from India, then it will create problem for the Indian economy. So we need to diversify the export destination. Same way, our export basket is also not diversified. The reason, as you can see, 10% of the goods account for almost 80% of our exports. So for example, engineering goods, like I said, they account for 25% of our exports. Petroleum goods also account for almost 20% of our exports. So we need to have a diversified export base so that in future we are not affected by just few commodities. Accordingly, in this year's budget, the finance minister has announced that the government will be launching an export promotion mission. The main idea of the export promotion mission is to coordinate with different ministries and departments within the government and to diversify our export basket also and export destination also. Further, MSMEs, they are considered to be the backbone of the Indian economy. They account for almost 40 to 45% of our manufacturing exports. But these MSMEs face number of problems and challenges. One of the most important problem is lack of access to credit. So in order to ensure that MSMEs get easy credit, we are going to facilitate export credit as well as cross-border factoring support. So what do you mean by cross-border factoring support? Let me just explain this through a simple example. Let's say I own a particular MSME and my MSME, for example, export goods to a country X. The importer in country X might not be able to make immediate payment. So instead of immediate payment, the importer in that particular country can give me a trade receivable. So this trade receivable might say that the importer would make me the payment after, let's say, 1 month. So I, as an entrepreneur of MSME, what I can do is I can sell this trade receivable to a bank, to a NBFC. By selling it to a bank or NBFC, I will get immediate credit or immediate money, which I can use it for my operational expenses. So this factoring is so far limited to India only. Now we are going to facilitate cross-border factoring as well. Apart from that, we are going to support MSMEs to tackle non-tariff measures. What are these non-tariff measures? That is our next topic. So we'll discuss what are these non-tariff measures. The second thing is integration into global value chains. What is a global value chain? You can simply say global value chain is a international production sharing mechanism where different countries will contribute to production of a particular product depending upon their area of expertise. The best example of global value chain is that of iPhone. So you can see in case of iPhone, US focuses on research and development and design of iPhone. Countries such as Taiwan will provide for critical intermediate inputs like semiconductors. And the final assembly of iPhone might take place in India. So different countries are contributing to the production of iPhone based upon their area of expertise, right? So this is what is global value chain. China has got immensely benefited by integrating into global value chain. Now, as far as India is concerned, it is being said that India's integration into global value chain is quite poor. To measure to what extent India is integrated into global value chain, there is an index called as GVC Participation Index, which is published by OECD. According to this index, India's participation into GVC is just 40 as compared to 52 for Vietnam and 60 for Malaysia. So one is obviously poor integration of India into global value chains. Secondly, as you can see, India has put higher focus on forward linkages as compared to backward linkages. So this becomes quite important as to what is backward linkage and forward linkage in the context of global value chain. Let me explain this through an example. Now let's say this is India. India can have a backward linkage. Backward linkage means we would import raw materials or intermediate inputs from other countries. After importing intermediate inputs or raw materials, we'll do value addition to those inputs. And then we will be exporting the finished products to other countries. That is what is backward linkage. An example of which is something like this. Like India might import cotton fabric from other country. After importing cotton fabric, we do value addition to the cotton fabric, convert this into cotton textile, let's say shirt, pant, and then we export it to other country. This is an example of backward linkage. Same way, we might import critical intermediate inputs or raw materials for manufacturing of a car. Then we produce a finished car, and this finished car is then exported to other country. Another example of backward linkage. What is a forward linkage then? In case of forward linkage, what we generally do is we export raw materials or intermediate inputs to other countries. For example, in case of forward linkage, what it might so happen is that India might export cotton fabric to other country, and other countries will do value addition, convert it into cotton shirt or cotton pant, and then export it or use it in their own country. So that is what is forward linkage. As you can see, between the backward linkage and forward linkage, I would say that backward linkage is more beneficial for India, because the kind of value addition that we are doing is immense, because we are processing the raw materials into finished product. So obviously the amount of money that we get will be substantially higher. But in case of forward linkage, we are not exporting finished product, right? Rather, we are exporting an intermediate product for which the value that we'll get is less. So the problem as far as India's participation in global value chains is concerned is India has focused more on forward linkages rather than backward linkages. So you obviously know what has to be done. So India has to improve its participation in GVC. That's the first thing. And secondly, it has to ensure that within GVC, its participation, especially in backward linkages, should increase. That is what the budget has announced. The next one is trade logistics. See, if you're an importer or an exporter in India, they are involved, you must be involved in a number of trade documentation, which means you have to fill up a number of forms. And these forms must have to be filled up with multiple departments. Example being, let's say, Director General of Foreign Trade or Customs Department, GST Department. So for trade documentation, you'll have to approach multiple departments. Same way, if you as an importer or exporter, if you need credit, you have to approach multiple financiers, which could be, let's say, Exim Bank, a commercial bank, or let's say NBFC. The problem in case of India is it is being said on an average, an importer or an exporter would have to approach 30 different agencies for documentation as well as financing. And each of these 30 different agencies, they have their own IT setup, IT system, where you'll have to apply for getting the approval, either for trade documentation or for taking a loan. So this obviously imposes a lot of compliance burden on the people involved in trade, right? So this is a problem. So to solve this particular problem, the finance minister in this year's budget has said that the government will be launching a unified portal called as Bharat Trade Net. So how is it different? Until now, importer or exporter would have to file either for trade documentation or to get loans on different platforms. Now, instead of getting approval from multiple platforms, now they will get the approval from one single platform. And this is going to be like a one-stop solution for the people involved in trade. This is a very good development when it comes to promoting ease of doing business. And I would say that this is an important component of systematic deregulation, which the economic survey has been highlighting about. Next one is global capability centers. What are these global capability centers? When you look at multinational companies can be involved in certain core operations and non-core operations. The non-core operations of multinational companies could be like customer support. Customer support can be in the form of call centers. Core operations of a multinational company could be in the form of research and development, finance, or accounting. It could be in terms of marketing and sales, right? So some of this are its core operations. Until now, that is almost 2 to 3 decades back, 20 to 30 years back, you know that most of the multinational companies, they used to outsource their non-core operations to India. That is why, India was typically called as call center of the world or the BPO of the world. That was the situation earlier. But now what has happened is these multinational companies are now setting up their presence in India through a subsidiary. And that particular presence is not for customer support. That presence in India is for carrying out core operations like research and development, finance and accounting, marketing and sales. So these centers set up by multinational companies in India, which are involved in core business activities, we call those centers as global capability centers. In fact, it is being said the first start for global capability centers was made by a company called as Texas Instruments. Texas Instruments, a US based company, for the first time set up its R&D center in Bangalore. And since then, a number of foreign companies have set up their global capability centers in India. Some of these companies include, say, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Microsoft. So some of these companies have set up their global capability centers in India. And the significance of that is, number one, it creates jobs, particularly in the high-end sector. Apart from that, it will boost our GDP. And more importantly, it will also boost our exports, right? So presently, if you see with respect to global capability centers, India has around 1,700 global capability centers employing around 1.9 million people. 88% of the global capability centers are concentrated in tier 1 cities. So there is a need to promote global capability centers even in tier 2 cities also, so that it leads to balanced regional development. For example, recently, Karnataka government has come up with a comprehensive global capability centers vision 24-29. In this particular vision document, Karnataka government is set to provide for incentives to the multinational companies to set up these GCCs in the tier 2 cities of Karnataka. So obviously, we need to provide hand-holding support to the states so that they are able to promote global capability centers in tier 2 cities, right? Accordingly, in this year's budget, finance minister has said that the government will come up with national policy framework wherein we will be guiding the states to set up GCC in the tier 2 cities. So these are some of the budget announcements related to trade. Let's see how questions are likely to be asked in your prelims examination from these budget announcements. Look at this. In the context of global value chains, consider the following statements. Backward linkage, consider the following pairs of items. Backward linkage, export of intermediate goods to other countries. No, it is export of finished goods to other countries. Forward linkage is export of intermediate goods to other countries. Smile curve highlights the value addition in each stage of GVC. For example, if you see, this is the value addition along the y-axis. You can see here you could have research and development. Here you could have design of the product. Here you could have assembly of the product, then marketing and sales. So this curve shows the value addition which is taking place at each stage of production. And the highest value addition is taking place in research and development, and lowest value addition is taking place in assembly of the components. This curve looks like smile. That's why it is called as smile curve, right? So if you see the right answer in this case is 3 only. You can see this question, which of the following best describes the concept of global capability centers? You can read the options given here. Read the options very carefully. They can be confusing sometimes. After going through the option, please let me know the correct answer in the comment section. If it is wrong, I'll correct you, don't worry. Now let's move to the next topic. The next topic is rise in non-tariff measures. So what exactly are these non-tariff measures? Let's understand this in detail. So let's say this is a particular country. This country is importing goods from other countries, rest of the world. On import of goods from other country, the country in question can impose two types of barriers to trade. One barrier is called as tariff barrier. This tariff barrier is in the form of customs duty. So this country could increase the custom duty on import of goods. That is a tariff barrier. Any other barrier except the custom duty. Please remember this. Any other barrier except custom duty, we will call these barriers as non-tariff measures. And these non-tariff measures could significantly impact both the quantity as well as prices of the products. So that is what is non-tariff measure. So let's see what's the background to the non-tariff measures. The economic survey has highlighted that in last 1 decade or so, the overall tariff barriers has got reduced at a global level, and that is thanks to WTO, World Trade Organization. All the countries have reduced their tariff barriers. Ideally, decrease in tariff barriers should lead to expansion of global trade, right? The global trade should expand in the last 10 to 15 years because the customs duty has got reduced. But remember, in the topic of geo-economic fragmentation, we discussed that there is stagnation in the global trade. Now, this is an irony because on one side, the custom duty is reducing, but while on the other side, the global trade has got stagnated. The reason for this is very simple. The economic survey has highlighted that this decrease in customs duty is accompanied by increase in the non-tariff measures. So the thing here is the nature of barriers have got changed from tariff to non-tariff, but overall trade barriers are still there only, na? Right? It has only got changed in terms of nature. So because of increase in non-tariff measures by the countries, the global trade has got stagnated. So as far as your UPSC prelims examination is concerned, you should know what are these non-tariff measures. For example, in UPSC prelims, you could get a question something like this. Which among the following are the non-tariff measures imposed by a particular country? That is one. Second, from the perspective of your mains examination, you should know how do these non-tariff measures have an adverse effect on the Indian economy, right? So that is what we are going to look into one by one. So you can read the definition of non-tariff measure. According to United Nations Council for Trade and Development, non-tariff measure is any policy measure which is not in the form of ordinary customs duty, but still such a measure can impact international trade in goods either in terms of quantity or prices. And please understand that non-tariff measures are not just on imports. Non-tariff measures can be imposed even on exports as well. So what are these non-tariff measures? Let's understand them one by one. First one is sanitary and phytosanitary measures. Sanitary and phytosanitary measures means if a particular country is importing certain goods, and if it believes that import of such goods can have an adverse effect on the health of plants, on the health of animals, or human beings. So if import of a particular commodity is going to have an adverse effect on health of plants, animals, and human beings, in that case, a particular country can impose certain non-tariff measures. These non-tariff measures are called as sanitary and phytosanitary measures. An example of which is, let's say India is importing poultry from an area which is affected by avian influenza. So for a temporary period, we can actually ban the import of poultry from the areas affected by avian influenza. Similarly, if US is importing basmati rice from India, US can impose restrictions with respect to maximum pesticide and insecticide residue in that basmati rice. So it may say that insecticide and pesticide residue should be below this particular level. Only then we would import, because it wants to safeguard the health of the people in US. So this is a sanitary and phytosanitary measure. Technical barriers to trade. What is a technical barrier to trade? Let's understand here some examples. Import licensing requirement. Let's say within India, if someone wants to import a goods from another country, and if the government says to that particular person, importer, that before importing the commodity, you must compulsorily take our approval. You must compulsorily take a license. We can consider this to be a kind of technical barrier to trade. For example, India has done so with respect to laptops, smartphones. So even though it's not strictly a import licensing, So Indian government has said that if someone is importing laptops, smartphones, tablets, they have to upload the details onto a particular portal so that the government is able to keep a track as to from where or from which particular country we are importing laptops, tablets, and smartphones. This we can call it as a kind of non-tariff measure. Same way, we can say that lead should not be used in paints, or we can put a different packaging requirement, like with respect to certain special product, we could say that the packaging should be in such a manner that its shelf life of a product should be higher. So this becomes a technical barrier. So here, certain technical requirements which are laid on a product, they are acting like a barrier to trade. Pre-shipment inspection. What is this pre-shipment inspection? Let's say India and Japan, they are involved in trade. And India is, for example, exporting shrimp, a marine product, to Japan. Now, Japan could appoint a third party agency to inspect this particular shrimp before it is exported to Japan. This third party agency will inspect whether the shrimp that we are exporting to Japan is of good quality or not. So even before exporting, that is even before we are shipping the products, there is an inspection which is done by a third party entity. And this is basically done in a exporting country, which is in India. Contingent trade protective measures. Sometimes, to protect our domestic industry, apart from customs duty, we can impose countervailing duty to counter the entry of subsidized products into India. We can impose anti-dumping duty to counter dumping of products, let's say Chinese steel, into India. Safeguard duty is to counter sudden surge in volume of the products. Suddenly, if we are importing more products from other countries, which may have an adverse effect on our domestic industry, even those measures are also considered to be non-tariff measures. Quota. Quota here means if you put a quantitative restriction on import of a commodity, even that is a kind of non-tariff measure. Let's say if India puts a limit that from US in 1 year will import only 100 tons of, let's say, rice or wheat, it is like a quota. Tariff rate quota. Now this is very interesting. You can see tariff rate quota, it's actually combination of two measures. That is, one side it is tariff and the other one is quota. So how does it work? For example, here India might say that for first 100 tons of rice that we import, for first 100 tons of rice, we will import rice at 0% customs duty. It means for first 100 tons, there is no custom duty. But beyond 100 tons of rice, if we are importing rice, then the custom duty will be rupees 10 per kg. So what is happening here in this particular measure, there is a combination of tariff also and there is and quota also. Up to a particular limit, no custom duty. But as soon as the limit increases, custom duty will increase. That is what is tariff rate quota. Subsidies. Now, for example, if we are giving more subsidies to our domestic companies, it might so happen that the prices of the products in India will reduce. If the prices of our domestic products reduce, the foreign products that we are importing will become costly, right? So it is unfair to the foreign goods. So even the subsidies that we give to our domestic companies is like a non-tariff measure. For an example, let's say we are giving more subsidies to our domestic manufacturers who are manufacturing solar panel cells. What will happen to the domestic production of solar panel cells? The cost will reduce. So the import of solar panel cells will become costly then. So it is kind of non-tariff measure. That is what I was highlighting. Minimum import price. So we might say that when we import a particular commodity, we will import a commodity at a certain minimum price only. So once again, it is acting like a non-tariff measure. As far as exports are concerned, with respect to exports, there are two types. One is if you put a ban on exports, like India put a ban on export of non-basmati rice, wheat, sugar. It is a non-tariff measure. Second one is minimum export price. Like if you say that if at all exports would have to be made to other countries, the exports would have to be made at a particular price only. So there's a minimum price that we are putting. And if this price as such is deliberately set higher, then obviously our exports will reduce, right? So it is a kind of non-tariff measure that we can do. For example, India had imposed minimum export price on onions, basically to discourage the export of onions and ensure more availability of onions in our domestic market. So when you see all these non-tariff measures, I can say that these non-tariff measures are like a double-edged sword. Why I'm saying double-edged sword is because in certain cases, they are actually beneficial. They are needed actually. Take for example, sanitary and phytosanitary measure, technical barriers to trade, like maximum pesticide residue, use of lead in paints, packaging requirement, countervailing duty, anti-dumping duty, safeguard duty, they're obviously needed because they will help protect our domestic industry. They will help protect the health of plants, animals, as well as human beings. But on the other side, these non-tariff measures, they can be misused to reduce imports from other countries. For example, let's say, just as an example, if US does not want to import basmati rice, so US can deliberately set high sanitary and phytosanitary standards, which India might not be able to meet. So US is not doing it to protect the health of plants, animals, or people in US. Rather US is doing it to prevent the import of basmati rice from India. So in a way, it is like a barrier only. And that is what economic survey is highlighting, that ideally these non-tariff measures should be used for beneficial purpose. But rather than using it for beneficial purpose, countries are misusing these provisions to erect barriers to prevent imports. Now, why is it a problem? It is a problem because you must understand tariff barriers, right? Like customs duty. Tariff barriers are actually visible. And you must understand when something is visible, you can actually correct it, right? The problem with non-tariff measures is they are invisible. And when it is invisible, the problem is actually quantifying it, or problem here is addressing it, because you don't know how much is the non-tariff measures imposed across the world. So that is a more problem of concern, which the economic survey has highlighted. Let's look at an example of non-tariff measure and how it is affecting India. The best example of non-tariff measure that we can see here is carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is proposed to be introduced by EU. So as you know, European Union has said that if it is importing certain products, which may have led to emission of more greenhouse gases, on import of such products, European Union is going to impose higher customs duty. Which are these products? The products include iron and steel, aluminum, fertilizers, cement. So if India is exporting these products to EU, because to manufacture these products, more greenhouse gases had to be emitted, EU is going to impose a carbon border adjustment mechanism tax. Now this carbon border adjustment mechanism tax, you must consider this to be a kind of non-tariff measure. See, one side, you could argue that this is needed because we want to prevent the adverse effects of climate change. You could argue that way. But other way, it can be argued that European Union is deliberately imposing CBAM in order to prevent India's exports to EU. To prevent India's exports, it is like a barrier to India's trade, right? So for EU, you must understand, EU has become developed basically by emitting more greenhouse gases. And after becoming a developed country, now it is trying to prevent other countries from exporting products which emit more greenhouse gases. So economic survey says it's like a double standard, because you have done it in the past, that is EU has done it in the past, and now when India is trying to do it, it is trying to prevent India. So it's nothing but double standards. Apart from that, economic survey has highlighted that India's exports of iron and steel, aluminum, cement, fertilizers to EU are going to be adversely affected. For example, as you can see, according to World Bank's CBAM exposure index, India has a high score, which means it has a high exposure to carbon border adjustment mechanism. So this is one problem. The other problem is EU has also come up with European Union deforestation regulation. What is this regulation? European Union has said that if any country is exporting product to EU, such a country has to provide a certificate that a product has been produced without clearing the forest, without undertaking deforestation. The product has been produced. For example, let's say we are exporting furniture. Just as an example, we are exporting furniture to EU. While exporting furniture to EU, we have to provide a certificate that the wood which was used to manufacture that particular furniture was not procured from forest. It was not procured after cutting down trees in the forest. This is a kind of certificate that we have to give to European Union. Same way, if we are exporting rice to European Union, we have to provide a certificate saying that the rice so produced was not produced after cutting down forest. So that is what is a kind of certificate that we have to give to European Union. Now the problem once again is, one way you can say it is good because it is encouraging the countries to be more responsible in protecting their forest. One way it is good, but other way it is being said that it shows the double standards of EU. The reason is very simple. I've highlighted it here. As you can see, between 1990 to 2020, across the world, almost 420 million hectares of forest was lost globally. This is the total forest. And in Europe, almost 15% of deforestation was done. And after deforestation, this land was converted to agricultural land. European Union has cut down trees and it has shifted to agriculture. It has already done it. Now, when it comes to India, it is saying that if you are exporting products which are produced after cutting down forests, you have to provide a certificate. So when EU has done it already, there was no one to question EU. But when India is trying to do it, it is asking us to provide a certificate, which once again shows a kind of double standards. So India has to counter this rising non-tariff measures at a global level, right? So let's see what are the recommendations. Even though economic survey has not given any specific recommendations, but institute, Global Trade Research Institute, has given some recommendations as to how should India tackle the non-tariff barriers. And as you can see, according to this report, India's exports are facing high non-tariff barriers. You can see all of this are specific examples of the products where India is facing high non-tariff barrier. So what should India do? Number one, we must improve the quality of the products that we are exporting to other countries, so that other countries do not have an excuse of imposing non-tariff barriers on our products. A case in point is, we must reduce the pesticide and insecticide residue in the basmati rice and non-basmati rice that we export to other countries. We must control the spread of foot and mouth disease, which adversely affects the cattle and hence might become problem if you are exporting, let's say, the dairy products, or let's say cattle products to other countries. And we must improve our inspection. So we have to improve the quality of our products. At the same time, we must engage with the partner countries. By engaging with the partner countries, we must identify the products where we are facing high non-tariff measures. And we must convince those countries to reduce the non-tariff measures. A case in point is, India is a global leader when it comes to export of pharmaceutical drugs. But to export pharmaceutical drugs to other countries, there are a lot of approvals that we would have to take in other countries. So this is a kind of non-tariff barrier. So we must engage with the other countries and convince them to do away with the complex registration, let's say for export of medicines. And if there are certain standards, non-tariff measures, which we think are not imposed for a beneficial purpose, but they are imposed in order to erect barriers, we must convince those countries to do away with those barriers. And if those countries do not do away with the barriers, we have to be brave and courageous, and we must be ready to retaliate as well. So if these countries are imposing higher non-tariff measures, we must also do the same thing for their products in our own country. Now, this is a recommendation given by Global Trade Research Institute. Let's move to the next one. You can have a look at the practice question number 10 and question number 11. So please try to solve these questions on your own, because I've already explained it, and let me know the answer in the comments section. Let's move to the next one, that is e-commerce exports. So let me tell you what exactly are e-commerce exports. For that, let's understand how does e-commerce industry in India works. For example, you have e-commerce companies such as Amazon or Flipkart. Now what they do, they bring together sellers and buyers in the domestic market, thus enabling the sellers to sell their products to the buyers across India. That is what is e-commerce industry. But we are talking about e-commerce exports. E-commerce exports basically means that these e-commerce companies will bring together sellers in India on a platform. Once these sellers are brought onto a platform, these sellers will list their products on the platform. And the buyers in this case will be located outside India, not in India. They are located in overseas market. So it's like saying someone based in US is ordering Ayurvedic products from India through e-commerce platform. Or someone based in France is ordering Indian handicraft products from a MSME based in India. It is an example of e-commerce exports. Presently, if you see, the overall e-commerce exports from India, it is around 4 to 5 billion dollar in the year 2023. But it is expected that by 2030, that is in another 7 years, the total e-commerce exports will increase to 200 to 300 billion dollars. So we are going to see a very rapid growth in e-commerce exports. Just think as to what could be the major driving force behind increase in e-commerce exports. Number one, you could say that there is rapid growth in internet, smartphones, right? So people based in other countries will be able to easily order for Indian products. Second, you could say that we have more uh, overseas Indians. A lot of Indians are located in other countries, and these Indians might prefer to buy Indian products. Apart from that, we can also say that it will give a big push to make in India for the world as well. So there are a number of factors which are going to drive e-commerce exports in future. Accordingly, this year's economic survey is talking about factors driving e-commerce exports. But I do think that UPSC is not going to ask you question on factors driving e-commerce exports. Rather, a probable question could be, what are the challenges which India faces in boosting e-commerce exports and how to address these challenges? That is more probable question as far as your mains examination is concerned. And as far as the prelims examination is concerned, you could have a question like this. Consider the following statements related to e-commerce exports from India and the initiatives taken by the government to boost e-commerce exports under the Foreign Trade Policy 2023. A mains question for practice, you can read here. India's e-commerce exports hold immense potential to grow significantly and become a key contributor to country's GDP. In the light of this statement, discuss challenges in promoting e-commerce exports and highlight the strategies to address these problems. So let's understand the e-commerce exports holistically, where we'll discuss present status, drivers, significance, initiatives, challenges, and strategies in the next 10 minutes. So we can see the present status of e-commerce exports, the driving factors, and you can see the significance. With respect to significance, I would want you to concentrate on how is it going to benefit MSMEs. See, with respect to MSMEs, the biggest problem with respect to the export of MSMEs is MSMEs are not being able to capitalize on marketing and branding of their products in the overseas market. Now, through e-commerce platform, it is quite easier for MSMEs to get more visibility on the e-commerce platforms. And more visibility on e-commerce platform means without undertaking substantial investment in marketing, they can boost their exports to other countries, right? Apart from that, it is also said that MSMEs will get higher profits per unit of the product because when they are going to sell through e-commerce, they eliminate middlemen, they eliminate intermediaries, they are directly selling the products to the customer. So it's like in e-commerce exports, it is B2C, business to customer, where you have eliminated the intermediaries. So you're going to get more profits that way. So that is why it is being said that we need to boost e-commerce exports. In fact, it is being said whatever success that we had in our IT sector, same success we could replicate even in our e-commerce exports as well. Now let's see what initiatives the government has taken in the Foreign Trade Policy 2023. Number one, government has launched Niryat Bandhu scheme. Niryat Bandhu scheme basically seeks to provide hand holding support to the sellers of the e-commerce platform. Basically, you are going to provide them hand holding support to sellers to list their products on the platform, to market their products on the platforms. That is what is the Niryat Bandhu scheme, where we are providing for hand holding support. Next one is e-commerce export hubs. What are these e-commerce export hubs? See, we are going to declare a geographically contiguous area as e-commerce export hub. In this particular export hub, in one particular area, we will have all the necessary infrastructure which is needed to boost our e-commerce exports. What kind of infrastructure? We will provide for storage, warehousing, packaging, labeling, certification, customs clearances, all these services which are needed to boost our e-commerce exports will be based in e-commerce export hub. Next one is financial assistance under market access initiative. So Niryat Bandhu scheme is more about providing hand-holding support to the sellers. Market access initiative is more about providing financial assistance to promote e-commerce exports, where we might provide financial assistance for marketing, capacity building, and for upgrading their technology. Next one is dark Niryat Kendras. What are these dark Niryat Kendras? See, within India, we have certain post offices which are called as foreign post offices. As the name suggests, foreign post offices, they basically handle the courier which is either coming into India from abroad, or the courier which is going out of India. So that kind of courier it is handling. We call them as foreign post offices. So if someone based in other country is ordering a product based in India, we have to courier the product. No? For that, we have to have a necessary infrastructure. We have that necessary infrastructure already in the form of foreign post offices. But we need to upgrade the infrastructure of foreign post offices. And that is what we are going to do for dark Niryat Kendras. So we are going to upgrade the infrastructure of foreign post offices in order to provide for e-commerce exports through the couriers. So these are some of the initiatives. Apart from that, I also want to tell you that e-commerce exports are also zero rated under GST. What is zero rating under GST? It basically means that if you are providing for e-commerce exports to other countries, two things: no need to pay any GST on your inputs. You don't have to pay any GST on inputs. Or if GST is paid on inputs, entire GST which is paid on inputs will be refunded back. So think of it. If let's say there's a small scale industry which is into manufacturing of let's say a handicraft. On manufacturing of handicraft, it is using certain inputs for which it may be paying some GST. So under zero rated regime, they don't have to pay GST. And in case if they have paid GST, they have to show tax invoice to the government. How much of GST they have paid, entire GST will be refunded. So as such, there's no tax burden on the sellers who are involved in e-commerce exports. So these are some important initiatives. Now let's see what are the challenges and strategies with respect to e-commerce exports. What I've done to make this understanding more crystal clear, I've highlighted the issues and challenges under different headings. That is first thing. Second, what I have also done is I have compared India's model of e-commerce exports with China's model. Why so? Because it is being said India has a lot to learn from the Chinese model of e-commerce exports. So China's e-commerce companies like Alibaba, they have become globally renowned for e-commerce exports. So we need to understand what policy has China followed to boost e-commerce exports and identify what is the lacunae in our policies, right? So let's understand one by one, starting with roles and responsibilities. Okay. As far as China is concerned, in China, the Chinese government has adopted a separate e-commerce law, a separate law to boost e-commerce exports. That is first thing. Second, in that particular law, it has clearly defined the roles and responsibilities of the seller and as well as e-commerce platform. In this law, the role of the seller is confined to taking approval to export the product from the government, and after taking approval, the seller will list the product on the e-commerce platform. That is the role of seller. When it comes to e-commerce platform like Alibaba, what they have to do is they have to take care of rest of the things. What are the rest of the things? They have to take care of logistics. They have to take care of customs clearance. They have to accept payment. So all other things are looked after by e-commerce company. So there is very well clear set of roles and responsibilities of seller and e-commerce company. Let's see what is as far as India is concerned. Number one, unlike China, we do not have separate e-commerce law. Second, unlike China, there is no well-defined roles and responsibilities between the seller and the e-commerce platform. In fact, it is being said in India, there is more burden on the seller with respect to e-commerce exports. In India, the seller is required to take approval from the government to export a product. They have to list their products. They have to arrange for logistics. They have to take customs clearances. So mostly the burden is falling on the seller. So obviously that is a problem. So taking a cue from Chinese model, it is suggested that we need to have a separate e-commerce law. That's the first thing. And that e-commerce law should have clear-cut roles and responsibilities defined for seller and the e-commerce platform, similar to what is done in China. That's the first thing. Let's see the second one. International order backed purchase and sale model. What is this international order backed purchase and sale model? In China, let's say you have a e-commerce company like Alibaba. What Alibaba as an e-commerce company do is, from MSMEs based in China, it could buy the products. After buying the products, the same products, Alibaba will sell it to the buyers across the globe. So can you see here the word international order backed purchase and sale? It means Alibaba will purchase the products from MSME. After purchasing the products from MSME, the products will become its own product, and the same product it will sell it to a buyer across the globe. That is what is international order backed purchase and sale. What about India? Let's see here. In India, you have Amazon and you have Flipkart. Now what Amazon and Flipkart do is they bring together seller and they bring together buyer. They create a platform to bring these two people on a single platform, enabling the seller to sell their products to buyer. Amazon and Flipkart, you must understand, they cannot own the inventory. When I say they can't own the inventory, basically means they cannot sell their own products. Can you see what is happening in China? Alibaba is purchasing products from MSMEs and the same product it is selling to buyers across the world. As far as India, Amazon and Flipkart, they cannot purchase the product from MSME and sell it to the buyers across the world. So there is lack of clarity on this with respect to whether they can do it or not. There's no explicit statement which says that they can purchase the products from, let's say, the sellers. So they cannot sell their inventory. Now, why is it important? Is because a lot of MSMEs in India, they might find it too cumbersome to take the approval of the government to list their products on the e-commerce platform. So in order to boost the export from MSMEs, we have to enable e-commerce platforms to purchase the products from MSMEs and sell the products directly to the overseas buyers. So that is what is international order backed the purchase and sale model. So we have to make changes in the FDI policy to enable international order backed purchase and sale model. Next, e-commerce export zones. China has set up e-commerce export zones, which is almost similar to e-commerce export hubs being proposed in India. In fact, we have borrowed this concept from Chinese model only. But the problem here is, so far, we have not established e-commerce export hubs. That is problem number one. Same way, in China, the custom clearance time is less than 1 day. But in India, the time taken for customs clearance is almost 4 to 6 days. Time is more. So the proposal here is, number one, we have to expedite setting up of e-commerce export zones. Second, in those e-commerce export zones, we must have a customs official stationed so that the time taken for custom clearances reduces to global standards. Apart from that, we must set up these e-commerce export hubs closer to the air cargo terminals. Next is payments. Now, with respect to China, in China, there is no time limit for realizing payment. No time limit for realizing payment means if there is a exporter, e-commerce exporter, they export products to overseas buyer. In China, within how much time the payment should be made, on that there is no limit. That is first thing. Second, maximum value of shipment in China, how much goods they can export through e-commerce, that is almost 50,000 US dollar. Let's see what is India and why it is problematic. As far as India is concerned, in India, there is higher time, the time limit to accept payment is just 9 months. It means if you export goods to overseas buyer, compulsorily the payments should be made within 9 months. So it is being said that the timeline for accepting payment in India is quite lower. Now, why is it a problem? I'll give you an example here to make you understand. Let's say there's an exporter based in India and he is exporting certain products through e-commerce, and those products are for bulk order. Something order for handicrafts which is in bulk, let's say thousands of handicrafts they are required to export. Or let's say they are required to export products which are highly customized according to the buyer's requirement. So because the products are customized, it will take more time, to produce the products. Same way, because they're bulk order, the orders cannot be sent at once. They will be sent over a period of time. So ideally, the time limit for accepting payment should be higher, not just 9 months. It being said that for bulk orders or customized products to accept payment, the time limit for accepting payment should be more than 9 months. Second, in India, the maximum value of shipment is just 12,000. Unlike China, where it is 50,000. So the value of the shipment which can be exported through e-commerce should increase. So those are the two things here. Let's see what is about return of goods. Let's say you order something on Amazon and you get the product, and let's say you don't really like the product, you place a return order, right? If this is happening in domestic market, the same should be facilitated at the international market. Let's say a person based in US orders a product from India. He does not really like the product. The person should be able to return the product, right? Let's see what happens in China. In China, if the products are returned back once again, when the products are returned back, obviously it's an import. But because it is returned back, the seller is not required to pay the import duty because the products are returned. And the custom clearance is also quite faster. So you have China exporting a product to rest of the world, e-commerce export, the product is returned back. So there is no import duty which is to be paid. As far as India is concerned, in India also, e-commerce imports are exempted from import duty. Just like China, there is no need to pay custom duty on import of the return orders. But the problem is, there has to be physical verification of these products, and physical verification of the products causes huge delays, which might be cumbersome for the foreign buyer. So we have to expedite this particular return procedure. Lastly, what China has done when it signs trade agreements with other countries. In those trade agreements, China ensures that there is a special provision related to e-commerce trade, which will enable China to boost its e-commerce exports. As far as India is concerned, you know that India has signed free trade agreements with a number of countries. But unfortunately, in these free trade agreements, we have not set up a separate provision to boost e-commerce exports. So the idea is, next time, whenever we sign a trade agreement with other country, there has to be a separate chapter, a separate provision to facilitate trade of e-commerce goods. So that is what are the challenges and strategies. Let's have a look at the practice questions. I've already covered these practice questions. Please carefully have a look at the questions and let me know the answers in the chat box. In case if your answer is wrong, I'll correct it. Don't worry. And let's have a look at the main practice question. If you read the statement question carefully, in the question there is a statement. Ideally, if there's a statement in the question, the introduction to such a question should elaborate the statement. So the best way to introduce this particular question, the answer is highlight the present status and significance of e-commerce exports. So it could be something like this. E-commerce exports from India accounted for $4 to $5 billion in 2023 and expected to reach $200 to $300 billion by 2030. The Foreign Trade Policy 2023 seeks to promote e-commerce exports to promote one district, one product and integrate MSMEs into global economy. And when you read the question carefully, in the question, there are actually two parts, challenges and strategies. But as a value addition, before you start the body of the answer, you could incorporate hub and spoke diagram highlighting the drivers of e-commerce exports. What are the factors which are leading to increase in e-commerce exports? After that, write challenges and strategies in bullet points. Ideally, you could incorporate a table in the tabular format, one side challenges, on the other side strategies. After that, you could briefly mention about some initiatives which are already taken by the government, which is taken in the Foreign Trade Policy 2023. And finally, as far as the conclusion is concerned, in the conclusion, you could highlight long-term implications of boosting e-commerce exports. What can be the long-term implications? You can see, going forward, the adoption of above strategies would promote innovation at grassroots level. Second, replicate success story of India's IT sector. and enable India to pursue export-led model to meet the target of $4 trillion merchandise exports by 2030. This is a kind of power-packed conclusion that you should be able to write in the mains. So having discussed about e-commerce exports, let's move to the next topic. The next topic is about foreign direct investment. Like I said at the start of my discussion, in the previous year prelims, repeatedly questions have been asked on different dimensions of FDI, which includes, as you can see, characteristic of FDI, difference between FDI and FPI, instruments of FDI, components of FDI, and the latest one is with respect to FDI in the e-commerce sector. Obviously, I cannot discuss all of this in the economic survey discussion because it is beyond the scope of the economic survey discussion. But what I can do is all the prelims pointers that you need to know with respect to FDI, I have incorporated here. All the prelims pointers related to FDI, plus I have also highlighted the recent trends in FDI. This is from the latest report. So you can just have a look at all of these things. Based upon that, I would want you guys to have a look at these 4 practice questions, 14, 15, 16, 17, and let me know the answer in the chat box. Now let's see one of the recent change in FDI policy which has done in this year's budget. In this year's budget, one important change which has been proposed by Finance Minister is with respect to FDI in the insurance sector. Until this year's budget, FDI in the insurance sector was allowed only up to 74%. But Finance Minister has announced that FDI in the insurance sector will be increased to 100%. But it will be increased to 100% provided the insurance company which is making investment in India, it should agree that whatever insurance premium it is collecting from Indians, all of that insurance premium, it will reinvest back in India. Only then the 100% FDI will be applicable. Apart from this important change, there is another change with respect to entry of foreign lawyers and foreign law firms into India. Please go through this, right? It is quite self-explanatory. In case if you have any doubt, let me know in the chat box. I will respond to your queries. Don't worry about it. Okay. There's something more important which I wanted to discuss. This is with respect to recent developments in FDI. One development in FDI is the gross FDI inflows into India. The gross FDI inflows have increased to $1 trillion since April 2000. So in the last 24 years, the total FDI into India have crossed $1 trillion, the gross FDI. So this is one important development. The second important development, as you can see, the net FDI inflows. Here we are talking about gross FDI inflows, and here we are talking about net FDI inflows. The net FDI inflows have sunk to 12-year low for the period April to October 2024. So far, UPSC has never asked a question related to difference between gross FDI and net FDI. In the context of the recent developments, which you can see on the screen, the topic of gross and net FDI becomes important. And that is what I'm going to cover. So let's understand what is gross FDI. Let's say this is India. Within India, let's say there is a foreign company. Foreign companies are making investment in India in the form of FDI. Apart from making investment in India, what they can also do is They can also make or they can also reinvest their earnings. What is this reinvested earnings? Let's talk about an example like Starbucks. Starbucks has come into India, set up its shops, set up its retail outlets. It is a investment in India. It might so happen that Starbucks is earning profit. Those profit which is earning in a year, it might be reinvesting it back in India. Those reinvested profits is also considered to be FDI. Example, let's say when the company made initial investment of $100 billion. Later, in the year 2024, it earned a profit of $10 billion and entire $10 billion it invested in India. Total FDI will become $110 billion. 2025, let's say it invested another $10 billion. Gross FDI, total gross FDI will become 100 plus 10, which is $120 billion. It's like a stock concept, right? Like total amount of FDI which has been invested by this particular company in India. This is a kind of gross FDI. What is net FDI then? Now, this foreign company which has made investment in India, what it can do, some amount of money, it can take it back. Some profits, it can take it back to its own country, overseas country. It is called as repatriations. So, like let's say in the year 2026, it has earned a profit of $10 billion, out of which it invests $5 billion in India, and remaining $5 billion it will take out of India. So it is repatriations. So repatriations is excluded from the gross FDI. That is one thing. Apart from that, let's say similar to this, you have Indian company which is making overseas investment, and it is also making making investment of it is reinvesting its profits in other countries. So you have an Indian company goes abroad, establishes its company there, and whatever profit it earns there, it is investing it back in that home country. And same way, Indian company might be getting back some of its profit which it is earning outside India back into India, repatriations. So when you see net FDI, how is net FDI calculated? Let's see this. Net FDI is calculated as 1 minus 2. What is 1? 1 is FDI by foreigners. And how is it calculated? FDI inflows plus retained earnings minus repatriation. So it is like saying this plus this minus this. This is the FDI by foreigners minus 2. What is 2? FDI by Indians. That is Indian investment overseas plus retained earnings or reinvested earnings minus repatriation. That is how you'll get to know the net FDI. Okay. So here, what you have to see here, gross FDI is how much money is coming into India, which is in terms of foreign investment plus reinvested earnings, or we can also call it as retained earnings. That is gross FDI. From gross FDI, we have to deduct the retained earnings, repatriated profits of foreign companies, and also deduct the Indian overseas investment, retained earnings, and add the repatriation that we get into India. So that is how we calculate net FDI. Now, the economic survey highlights that the gross FDI into India has actually reduced in the last 3 years. As you can see, in the last 3 years, the gross FDI has reduced. There are multiple reasons for that. Reason number one, as you can see, there is increase in interest rates in the advanced economies in the post-pandemic recent past. So after COVID pandemic, the rate of inflation in advanced economies had increased. So to counter inflation, the central banks in these advanced economies had increased the interest rate. So higher interest rate means less inflow of foreign investment into India. That is reason number one. Reason number two, remember we covered about geo-economic fragmentation which is taking place, right? So that geo-economic fragmentation is also leading to decrease in FDI inflows. What about net FDI? Net FDI has shrunk to 12-year low. Why is that? Think of this particular uh, formula for net FDI. According to economic survey, it highlights that repatriation of foreign companies based in India has increased. So whatever profits the foreign companies are earning in India, more of the profits, rather than investing in India, they're sending it back to their other countries. That is reason number one. Second, it is also being said that FDI by Indians in other countries is increasing. More Indians are making investment outside India. So that is why the net FDI inflows have shrunk to 12-year low. So you can see the reasons: higher repatriation of profits by foreign companies and increase in overseas investment by Indian companies. So you can just have a look at these two practice questions. Please try to answer these practice questions. They are very easy. I've already explained that in the discussion. Now coming to the next topic about model bilateral investment treaty. What is this model bilateral investment treaty? Let's try to understand here. Generally, let's say if there is a overseas investor based in other country, this overseas investor might be making investment in India. So when this overseas investor makes investment in India, right, we have to assure that these foreign investors that look, you make investment in India and we will ensure that your investments are protected. Protected in what way? For example, we can say that we will provide you with legal clarity. We will not make unnecessary changes in laws which will go against your interest. That is one. Or we can actually say you make investment in India, the state, that is the government, will not take over your investment or your property. So when we give such kind of assurance to the foreign investors that your investment is going to be safe, it will encourage more foreign investment into India, right? So we have to provide them with legal certainty, legal clarity. We have to provide them with the assurance that, look, you make investment in India, the government is not going to take over your investment. So these kind of assurances that we give will help us attract more investment. Accordingly, India had signed bilateral investment treaties with number of countries. But what actually happened is, it is being said, these bilateral investment treaties were more in favor of foreign investors because they were mostly loaded in the name of foreign investors. It went against our interest. How so? You'll get to know in the next part. Don't worry. So what happened in the year 2016? India cancelled all the bilateral investment treaties which it has signed with other countries. In its place, India in the year 2016 came up with a new treaty called as Model Bilateral Investment Treaty. It is being said this Model Bilateral Investment Treaty is more in the favor of government rather than investor. So you must understand, earlier bilateral investment treaty was more in favor of investor. Now model BIT is more in the favor of government. So what has got changed? This is very important because in this year's budget, finance minister has announced that government is going to rework this model BIT. So what is this BIT? Let's understand through a tabular format. So you can see here, new model bilateral investment treaty to be attuned to the demands of global investment environment as highlighted by Chief Economic Advisor. So let's see here with respect to earlier BIT, what was the criteria, what was the problem in that criteria, and how this problem has been rectified in model bilateral investment treaty. Let's see here the first one, definition of investment. Definition of investment means what kind of investment is protected again under the bilateral investment treaty. Earlier, the definition for protecting investment was called as asset-based definition. Asset-based definition, as the name suggests, all kind of assets were protected, be it tangible assets or intangible assets. Tangible assets means if someone has set up a physical presence in India, that becomes a tangible investment. Someone does not set up a physical presence, but they have only intangible investment. What can be intangible investment? Let's say shares, bonds, patents. These are intangible investments, right? So earlier, the definition of what kind of investment would be protected was very broad based, which covered both tangible investment as well as intangible assets. What was the problem? The problem was the definition of what would be covered under the BIT was very broad, very comprehensive, which enabled the foreign enterprises or foreign investors to sue Indian government without setting up their physical presence in India. For example, under BIT, we give protection to tangible assets. That is quite understandable. Someone is having a physical presence like a office, branch or factory, will protect them. Obviously not a problem. But what if someone has made a intangible investment like share? They're not set up a physical presence. They just made a investment in share, and even those people could sue the Indian government. For example, let's say government makes some changes in policies, and those changes in policies leads to fall in the value of shares held by foreign investors. So foreign investors could sue the government saying that, look, you gave us legal certainty with respect to your investment in shares, but now you're not giving that kind of legal certainty because you're changing the laws frequently. Getting it? So in order to reduce the scope of what is to be protected, we have moved from asset-based definition to enterprise-based definition. Enterprise definition basically means we will protect only those investors who have set up their enterprises in India, who have substantial business operations in India. Foreign investors cannot simply invest in shares and bonds and claim protection under model BIT now. They can claim protection only when they have substantial physical operations in India. That is one important change. Coverage of IPRs, intellectual property rights, were they protected? Under BIT, they were protected. But what was the problem? The problem is if you give protection to intellectual property rights, that is patents held by foreign companies, then it becomes very difficult for the Indian government to issue compulsory licenses to drugs. What is this compulsory licensing? Let's say there is a pharmaceutical company, multinational company. It has got a patent over a life-saving drug. And this life-saving drug can be manufactured only by that multinational company. It enjoys monopoly in selling life-saving drug. So what it can do, it can deliberately sell the life-saving drug at a very high price, which can be unaffordable to the poor people, especially in a country like India. So to prevent that, government can issue compulsory licensing. Compulsory licensing means government can ask a domestic pharma company to manufacture this life-saving drug and sell it to the poor people at a lower price. Don't you think by issuing compulsory licensing, you're able to protect the interests of the poor people by ensuring that the poor people are able to afford medicines at a lower price? But if you give protection to patents held by these global pharma companies, we will not be able to issue compulsory licensing. That is why under model BIT, we said we will not protect intellectual property rights, that is patents of foreign companies. Dispute resolution. Now this was probably the most problematic under the BIT. Under the earlier bilateral investment treaty, we gave an undertaking to the foreign investors that if they had any problem with the Indian government, be it related to taxation, be it related to some policy, they can drag the Indian government directly before the arbitration tribunal at an international level. So we said that you can drag the Indian government before the arbitration tribunal without first approaching the courts in India, that is the domestic courts. So accordingly, the problem which it created was a number of foreign companies, particularly companies such as Vodafone, they tried to sue the Indian government before the international tribunals. Vodafone was a classical case of retrospective taxation. So it had sued the Indian government before the international tribunal. And as you know, Indian government does not want to be dragged before the international tribunal, right? Because we do believe that our own courts are more objective in passing judgments. So accordingly, in the model BIT, we have said that foreign investors must approach the Indian courts first before approaching international tribunals. They have to exhaust their domestic remedies before approaching international tribunals. In fact, we have said they cannot approach international tribunals in the first 5 years. Only after 5 years they can approach international tribunals. So that is what is the dispute resolution. Coverage of tax disputes. Earlier, if government made any changes in tax policies, and if those changes in tax policies went against the interests of foreign investors could have dragged the Indian government before the arbitration tribunal. In fact, the same thing happened in case of Vodafone. Now, the Indian government has said that foreign investors cannot sue the Indian government over the tax related matters, because tax related matters is our sovereign right and we will not be answerable to international tribunals. CSR obligation, that is corporate social responsibility. Earlier, there was no such obligation. Now we have put obligation. Lastly, MFN clause. Earlier, there was MFN clause in bilateral investment treaty. Because we had included MFN clause in the bilateral investment treaty, we were forced to treat all the foreign companies equally. It's like saying American company and Chinese company, they have to be treated on par. We cannot discriminate Chinese company against American company. That is a problem, which meant it hindered our ability to give certain leeways, certain flexibility to some companies which come from a country with which India has good friendly relations, like US, right? So concession extended to foreign investor of a particular country would be extended to foreign investors from other countries. The problem here was it prevented Indian government from having BITs with different countries according to its requirement. So now MFN clause has been done away with. This is another important development. So you need to know the provisions of model BIT, which becomes important from the perspective of your prelims examination. The next one is with respect to Forex reserves. As far as the topic of Forex reserves is concerned, I have recently covered this topic of Forex reserves in the current affairs video. So what I will do is in the description box below, I will give you the link to this particular topic of Forex reserves. And in this particular topic, I have covered the meaning of Forex reserves, components of Forex reserves, countries which have the highest Forex reserves, and more importantly, how do you measure the adequacy of Forex reserves, import cover, Greenspan Goodhart rule, ratio of reserves to broad money, ratio of reserves to financial outflows, and Forex reserves to GDP ratio. Please go through the video discussion and you can try to solve the practice questions which are given here. Now let's move to the last part of our discussion. The last part of our discussion is with respect to external debt. As you can see, the external debt to GDP ratio of India, it has fallen to 13-year low of 18.7% in the year 23-24. So there has been fall in external debt to GDP ratio. Why is it important? In prelims 2019, there was a question with respect to external debt of India. Similarly, you could get a question something like this about external debt. So let's briefly discuss about India's external debt. See, in the chapter of public finance, we covered the debt position of the government, right? Here, we are not talking about external debt of government. We are talking about external debt of India, which includes borrowings by the government as well as non-government, both of them together. So, accordingly, here you can see, based upon the borrower as to who is borrowing money, our external debt can be categorized into sovereign debt and non-sovereign debt. Sovereign debt means it is the money which is borrowed by central government and state government only. Please understand, it does not include the money borrowed by government owned PSUs. If government owned PSU like NHAI is borrowing money, will not include it as sovereign debt, will rather include it as non-sovereign debt. Sovereign debt is strictly confined to borrowings by center and state. What are these borrowings? Loans from multilateral institutions and foreign governments. FPI, investment in government securities, including SDL. It is also sovereign debt because we owe money to foreign investors. SDR allocations by IMF. If IMF is allocating SDR, on these SDR, we are required to pay interest. Understand that. So because we have to pay interest, it is our external debt. Non-sovereign debt means any other borrowing except the borrowing by center and state. And that can be the form of external commercial borrowing, trade credit, as well as NRI deposits. So as you can see, the share of non-sovereign debt is more than the share of sovereign debt. In fact, this was a question asked in previous year prelims. When you look at the denomination of debt, that is in what currency we borrow, it can be rupee denominated debt as well as foreign currency denominated debt. Now, what is rupee denominated debt? That is the borrowings in terms of rupees. It can be rupee denominated NRI deposits maintained by NRIs in India, FPI investment in government securities, FPI investment in corporate bonds because they are investing in terms of rupees, and finally the rupee denominated masala bonds. Everything else you can consider it to be foreign currency denominated debt. And as you can see, dollar denominated debt account for the highest share. With respect to duration, you could have short term and long term. Short term means where we are borrowing for less than 1 year. Long term means we are borrowing for more than 1 year. So in case of India, long term external debt is more than the short term external debt. Finally, we have a concept of debt service ratio. Debt service ratio, as you can see, is calculated as total debt service payments divided by total receipts in the current account. What is that debt service payment? Let's say our external debt is around $600 billion. In the year 2025, out of this $600 billion, a loan of, for example, $100 billion is maturing. So we have to repay back the principal. And on the remaining external debt, we are required to make a interest payment of, let's say, $50 billion. So our debt service payment is $100 billion plus $50 billion, which is $150 billion. And if you see, if our receipts in current account, here we are not looking at the net money in the current account, that is inflow minus outflow. We are simply looking at inflow of money in current account, receipts. That is basically export of goods, export of services, primary income earned by residents from non-residents, secondary income earned by residents from non-residents, that receipts only. If that is, for example, equal to $300 billion, you can see debt service ratio will be 150 divided by 300 into 100, which is like 50%. So in simple English, it tells us what percentage of your receipts in the current account we are using it to service our external debt. That is what is debt service ratio. Ideally, that should be lower. Apart from that, I have highlighted the recent trends in debt service, the India's external debt. All of this data is as per September 2024. It's mostly data. Please have a look at the data. I think it's quite self-explanatory. After going through this data and the trends, you can try to solve these two prelims questions for practice. And lastly, there is one topic which is inclusion of Indian bonds in Bloomberg index. Last year, Indian bonds were included in JP Morgan Global Bond Index. And now, recently, as you can see, in March 5th, 2024, Indian bonds are going to be added to Bloomberg Emerging Market Index. Because it's a recent development, it becomes important for your prelims. But I have covered this in one of the current affairs class recently. The link to this particular current affairs class, I will put it in the description box below. So after going through that particular discussion, you can try to solve this particular prelims question for practice, which is practice question number 26. So we have finally come to the end of our discussion. There are two things which I want to tell you. There are a number of practice questions which I have included in our discussion. Try to give answers to those practice questions. I'll look at the comment section. If I think that any of your answer is wrong, I'll correct it. That is one. Second, I will be sharing the link for two videos, right? One is about the Forex Reserves and the second one is about inclusion of Indian bonds in the Global Bond Index. Please go through this particular video discussion. So we'll meet next week. The next week is the fifth theme of industry, agriculture and services that we'll be covering in the next week. Till then, thank you so much. Keep studying.